Vienna in the winter of 1926 moved as if it were wrapped in velvet. The city did not hurry when the snow began to fall. It simply accepted the soft white hush, the way an old salon accepts the closing of a door, and the streets along the Ringstrasse grew quieter in their grandeur. Gas lamps and electric lamps shared the evening between them, each flame or filament surrounded by a pale halo, and the snow drifted through those halos like slow, thoughtful confetti. Behind tall windows, curtains glowed amber. Inside cafés, cups clinked gently, and the air was thick with the scent of coffee and warm pastry. Outside, the Danube wind passed through the avenues with an untroubled sigh, and the great buildings, opera, museums, palaces with their carved faces, held the cold like stone holds a secret. That evening, the sky was the color of pearl. It did not darken so much as deepen, turning from a light gray to a soft, deepening blue, and the first stars appeared like cautious thoughts. Carriages rolled over the cobblestones with a steady rhythm, their wheels muffled by slush. Motor cars moved more quietly than they had a decade earlier, as if even engines had learned to respect winter. From time to time a bell sounded, tram, church, or the delicate jingle of a harness, and each sound seemed to hang in the air for an extra second before dissolving. A night like this did not demand excitement. It invited attention. In a modest apartment not far from the edge of the Innere a young man stood by a narrow mirror and adjusted his collar with care. His name was Felix Adler. He was 28, with a calm face that suggested he listened more than he spoke, and with eyes the color of wet hazel wood. The room around him was tidy and quiet, furnished with practical restraint. A small desk with neatly stacked papers, a bookshelf filled with music scores and slim volumes of poetry, a coat stand by the door. A kettle had just been set aside. The scent of tea still lingered in the air, a gentle trace of bergamot. Felix had been raised with the idea that there was virtue in small things done correctly, and he carried that idea as lightly as one might carry a watch in the pocket, aware of it, respectful of it, but not showing it off. He buttoned his waistcoat and smoothed the front of his shirt, taking time to make sure the fabric lay properly. His tuxedo jacket was not new, yet it had been brushed and pressed until it looked as if it were. A winter ball was, after all, an occasion, and Vienna treated occasions with a particular seriousness. Still, Felix did not consider himself the kind of man who belonged to grand rooms full of chandeliers. He was a junior archivist at the Österreichische Nationalbibliothek, a keeper of old letters and careful margins. His days were spent among paper that had already lived a long life, and his evenings were often spent in silence, reading by lamplight, listening to music on the radio when the reception was clear. Tonight was different, not because he craved it, but because he had been invited, and because sometimes it felt wise to accept a door when it opened. The invitation lay folded on his desk beside a small brass paperweight shaped like a lion. It had arrived a week earlier, delivered by a messenger in a cap, and Felix had read it twice, as if the ink might change. The winter ball at the Palais Wallerstein, it said, held in honor of the season and for the benefit of a children's clinic. Felix's distant cousin, Herr Otto Reininger, had written a brief note at the bottom in a confident hand. "Come, Felix. One evening will not ruin you." It was a teasing sort of kindness, and Felix had smiled when he read it, though he had not answered at once. He had waited until the following day, then wrote a polite acceptance, choosing each word with care, as if he were writing to a stranger rather than family. Now, with the hour approaching, he took up his wool coat and gloves and stepped out into the corridor. The building's stairwell smelled faintly of coal and soap. A neighbor's radio played a distant waltz, thin through the wall, as if the city were already warming up for the night. Felix descended slowly, his hand on the banister, feeling the cold rising from the stone steps. Outside, the street welcomed him with a quiet whiteness. Snow lay in soft layers on ledges and windowsills, and the world seemed edged in sugar. He pulled his scarf higher and began to walk toward the nearest carriage stand. As he moved, the city unfolded its familiar patterns. A baker was closing his shop, sweeping the doorstep with slow strokes. A couple walked arm in arm, their steps matched, their breath visible like little clouds. A man sold roasted chestnuts from a cart, the coals glowing orange under a metal grate. The air was crisp enough to make every inhale feel clean, and Felix found that his mind, which often traveled in circles of thought, settled into a steady line. He passed a bookshop where the front window was arranged with holiday editions and leather-bound classics, and for a moment he paused to look. He imagined the warmth inside, the smell of paper and glue, the quiet. But tonight belonged to a different kind of room. At the carriage stand, he chose a fiacre with a horse that looked patient and well-fed, its breath rising in slow, rhythmic puffs. The driver nodded, his cheeks red from cold, and Felix gave the address. The carriage set off with a gentle rocking motion. The city, seen from within, seemed like a painted panorama. The broad curve of the Ringstrasse, the lamplight melting into the snow, the silhouettes of trees with bare branches like lace. Felix watched the facades pass, one grand building after another, and felt the odd sensation of being both part of the city and slightly outside it, as if he were observing himself through glass. As they approached the Palais, the street became busier. Carriages lined the curb like dark, glossy beetles. Motor cars arrived in careful succession, their tires crunching over frozen slush. Men in evening coats stepped down and offered their hands to women in fur-trimmed wraps, and the women descended with the unhurried grace of people who had practiced being composed. The entrance of the Palais Wallerstein was lit brightly, and the doors stood open as if to invite the winter itself to come in and be transformed into warmth. A pair of uniformed attendants stood at the top of the steps. Beyond them, Felix glimpsed an interior glow, golden and soft. The driver helped him down. Felix paid, thanked him, and took a moment to steady his thoughts. The air outside was sharp, but the warmth spilling out from the doorway was like a gentle hand. He climbed the steps, hearing the quiet murmur of voices and the distant tuning of instruments. A thin thread of music drifted outward, just a few notes, like someone testing the air. Felix handed his coat to an attendant and stepped into the foyer. Inside, the world changed. The palais smelled faintly of waxed wood and expensive perfume, with an underlying sweetness of flowers. The floor shone beneath his shoes, reflecting the chandelier light in soft, broken patterns. Guests moved through the space in small clusters, their laughter low, their voices modulated, as if they did not want to disturb the elegance of the room. Felix took in the details without rushing. The marble columns, the gilded mirrors, the arrangement of white roses and winter greenery in tall vases. A string quartet near the staircase was warming up, their bows drawing gentle sounds that felt like silk. He accepted a glass of water from a passing server and held it simply, more for the comfort of having something in his hand than for thirst. His cousin Otto was somewhere in the crowd, no doubt, and Felix intended to find him and offer the required greetings. Yet, before he moved, he allowed himself a breath of stillness. He had always found that the best way to enter a new place was not to push into it, but to listen to its rhythm. Here, the rhythm was slow and circular, like a waltz, that had not yet begun. The great doors to the ballroom were still partially closed, as if keeping a secret. Through the gap, Felix saw a glimpse of the space beyond, a ceiling painted with pale figures, chandeliers hanging like frozen waterfalls, and, on the far side, tall windows veiled with curtains. The snow outside pressed its quiet face against the glass. It was strange, Felix thought, how winter could be both severe and tender. It stripped the world down to essentials, yet it also softened edges, turning harsh lines into gentle curves. A footman announced the opening of the ballroom with a voice that carried without shouting. The doors swung wide. A warmer wave of sound emerged. Conversation, laughter, the first clear notes of a waltz beginning to form. Guests moved forward with an unspoken agreement, as if drawn by the same invisible thread. Felix set down his glass, straightened his shoulders, and followed, stepping into the glow. In the ballroom, everything seemed to breathe. The light was not merely bright, it was alive, caught in crystal and gold, reflected in polished surfaces, scattered across silk and satin. The music began properly now, the orchestra easing into a familiar waltz with a gentleness that made it feel less like performance and more like a shared lullaby. Couples found each other, hands met, and the first turns were careful, unhurried. It was not a night for spectacle, Felix sensed, but for slow beauty. He stood near the edge of the room, letting the movement settle around him. Faces passed in a soft blur, smiles, glances, the occasional nod of recognition. He noticed how the women's gowns caught the light like water, how the men's black coats created a steady background against which everything else shimmered. Somewhere, someone laughed in a low, delighted way, and the sound was as warm as a fire. Felix felt himself relax by degrees, as if the room were teaching his body that it was safe to be here. And then, in a moment that was almost too quiet to name, he noticed her. It was not dramatic. It was not a sudden silence, nor a spotlight turning. It was simply that his gaze, moving across the room, paused and did not immediately continue. Near a cluster of pale flowers arranged beside a column stood a young woman in a dress the color of midnight blue, the fabric deep and calm, like a winter sky just before snow. She was not dancing yet. She held herself with an ease that did not demand attention, and yet attention seemed to find her anyway, the way snow finds the branches of a tree. Her hair was pinned up with careful simplicity, and a few curls softened the line of her face. She looked toward the dancers with a quiet, reflective expression, as if she were listening not only to the music, but to something beneath it. Felix did not know her name. He did not know whether she belonged to this world more naturally than he did, or whether she, too, was standing at the edge for her own reasons. He only knew that her presence felt calm, and that calmness, in a room of glittering motion, was its own kind of magic. As the waltz continued, as the chandeliers shone, as snow drifted past the high windows like slow, patient feathers, Felix remained where he was for a beat longer than necessary, and allowed the evening to open, gently, into whatever it might become. The ballroom received Felix as if it had been waiting for him, not personally, but in the way a well-prepared room waits for any guest who steps inside with respectful attention. Warmth gathered beneath the painted ceiling and drifted downward in layers, as though the chandeliers were not only made of crystal, but also of gentle sunlight, caught and held for winter. Candlelight flickered in tall sconces along the walls, and their small flames softened the gilding, turning gold into honey. Velvet drapes framed the windows, and beyond them the snow continued to fall in patient silence, like a slow, continuous blessing that did not ask to be noticed. The orchestra played with care, letting the waltz breathe, and the dancers moved as if they were part of one wide circle, turning and returning, always finding their way back to the same calm center. Felix remained near the perimeter for a time, not from shyness exactly, but from habit. He had learned that the edge of a room could be the best place to understand it. From there, he could see how conversations formed and dissolved, how laughter rose and fell like the swell of a quiet sea, how a gloved hand rested briefly on an elbow before drifting away again. He watched the room as if it were a page filled with elegant handwriting, each person a line, each movement a curve. And again, his eyes found the young woman in midnight blue, standing with an ease that seemed to steady the air around her. She had begun to move now, not into the dance, but into the room's gentle current. She walked slowly, pausing to greet someone with a small smile, tilting her head as if to listen closely to a remark that might have been ordinary in anyone else's ears. Felix saw how people responded to her. They softened slightly. They seemed to speak more quietly, as though the calmness she carried was contagious. When she turned, the light touched her profile, and for a moment, Felix thought of porcelain. Something delicate, yes, but also enduring, made to last. He told himself that noticing was not the same as longing. It was simply attention. He had always been attentive. It was, in a sense, his profession. Yet something in the way she moved through the room felt like a melody he half remembered, as if Vienna itself had been humming it for years, and he had only just learned to hear it clearly. He did not follow her. He did not even step toward her. He only allowed his gaze to settle, then drift away, then return again as naturally as the waltz returned to its refrain. A familiar voice called his name, and Felix turned to see Otto Reininger approaching with the confident stride of a man who belonged wherever he went. Otto's hair was dark and neatly parted, his bow tie perfectly centered, his expression bright with the easy pleasure of hosting a night that looked precisely as it should. He clasped Felix's shoulder in greeting, spoke warmly of family obligations and civic generosity, and then guided him into the flow of introductions with the practiced skill of someone who could navigate a ballroom as easily as he navigated a business meeting. Felix offered polite words and careful smiles, letting Otto's energy carry him from one conversation to another. And in time, the room began to feel less like a vast stage and more like a large, well-lit library in which each group spoke its own quiet chapter. Felix heard names, affiliations, small anecdotes. A baron with a fondness for modern paintings. A professor who complained gently about the weather, as though it were an old acquaintance who had overstayed. A young couple who had recently returned from the Tyrol and spoke of snow there as if it were more authentic, more properly alpine. Felix nodded and responded with steady courtesy, and though he was not dazzling, he was present. People seemed to appreciate that. The world did not always need brilliance. Sometimes it needed steadiness, and Felix had always offered that without realizing it might be a kind of charm. When the music shifted to a softer piece, Otto excused himself to speak with a benefactor, and Felix drifted toward one of the tall windows. The curtains were pulled back slightly, and the glass was cool beneath the faint warmth of the room. Outside, the snow was thicker now, turning the city into a softened sketch. Felix watched a lamplight across the street blur behind the falling flakes, and he felt an odd gratitude for the contrast. Inside, warmth and sound. Outside, quiet and white. It was like breathing in and out, and he turned from the window and nearly collided with someone moving in the opposite direction. The moment was not clumsy, not dramatic. It was simply close. 2 paths crossed, 2 steps adjusted, and Felix found himself facing the young woman in midnight blue. Up close, she seemed even calmer, as if the room's shimmer could not disturb her composure. Her eyes were a clear, gray-green, reflective like winter water, and her expression held the faintest hint of amusement, less at him, perhaps, than at the small surprise of the moment. "I beg your pardon," Felix said quietly, his voice steady. "Not at all," she replied, and her English was absent, of course, yet in Felix's memory of the sound, it was as smooth as well-poured tea. Her German carried the gentle refinement of Vienna without sharpness. She looked at him for a heartbeat longer than necessary, then offered a small nod, as if acknowledging a shared understanding that accidents could be handled softly. Felix noticed then that her gloves were pale, ivory, or very light cream, and fitted so neatly that they seemed like part of her hands rather than an accessory. He noticed, too, a delicate embroidery near the wrist, a faint floral pattern that caught the light when she moved. He thought, absurdly, of the manuscripts he handled at the library, of margins decorated with tiny vines and flowers, as if the past had tried to make paper bloom. "My fault," Felix said, though it was no one's fault. "Hardly," she answered, and the corner of her mouth lifted again, a smile held back rather than released. "The room is full of turning." It was a simple phrase, yet it landed in Felix's thoughts like a small, warm stone placed in the palm. The room is full of turning. She did not wait for him to respond. She moved on with a quiet grace, and Felix, left with that sentence, felt the air shift slightly, as if he had stepped into a calmer pocket of the evening. He watched her from a respectful distance as she joined a conversation near a column. One of the women in the group leaned closer to say something, and the young woman listened with the same steady focus Felix had seen earlier. A name reached him then, carried by the gentle lift of someone's voice. Fräulein Elisabeth von Lichtenau. It was said without fanfare, as if the name itself were an ordinary thing, though it sounded to Felix like something written in a careful hand on thick paper. Elizabeth. He repeated it silently, not as a possession, but as a note he wished to remember. The hours moved with an unhurried elegance. The orchestra played waltzes and softer interludes, and the ballroom's circle of motion continued, never frantic, never loud. Felix accepted a small plate of delicate pastries and ate one slowly, tasting almond and sugar with the mild surprise of someone who rarely indulged. He spoke again with Otto briefly, and Otto, noticing Felix's attention drift now and then, teased him in a low voice, asking whether the library had finally produced a treasure worth attending a ball for. Felix deflected with a modest smile. He did not name Elizabeth. He did not even admit to himself what, precisely, had caught him. It was enough that the evening felt more vivid than he had expected. At one point, as the dance floor cleared for a moment and people rearranged themselves like pieces of a gentle puzzle, Felix found himself near Elizabeth again, close enough to hear her laughter, which was quiet and warm, like a bell muffled by snow. He did not approach. He did not interrupt. Instead, he stood still and allowed the sound to pass through him, a small detail to be filed away with other small details. The scent of roses, the glow of chandeliers, the way winter pressed softly against the windows. Later, when midnight began to approach, the mood shifted into a calm winding down. Guests began to speak of carriages and cold streets, of the comfort of home waiting beyond the palais. Coats were requested, wraps were gathered. The ballroom, though still bright, seemed to breathe more slowly, like a candle nearing the end of its hour. Felix felt a gentle tiredness settle in his limbs, not unpleasant, more like the heaviness of a warm blanket. He moved toward the edge of the room, preparing to retrieve his coat. Around him, people said their goodbyes with soft promises to meet again. Elizabeth was somewhere behind him, he thought. Perhaps near the flowers, perhaps already in the foyer. He did not look for her. He let her remain part of the evening's atmosphere, like music that faded but did not disappear. As he stepped through the threshold between the ballroom and the foyer, he heard a faint sound behind him. Fabric brushing fabric, a soft exhale of movement. He turned slightly, more by instinct than intention, and saw Elizabeth passing near the doorway, her pale gloves still on her hands. Or so it seemed. The crowd shifted. A pair of guests moved between them. The moment was gone. Felix continued forward. Yet, unseen in the gentle churn of departures, something small slipped free from order. On a chair near the edge of the ballroom, half hidden by a drape, overlooked in the warm dazzle, a pair of pale gloves came to rest, folded upon themselves as if they had chosen to sleep there. The music continued, quieter now. The chandeliers shone. Snow fell beyond the windows. And the night, full of turning, kept one small secret for later. The way fate sometimes does, by leaving a simple reason behind. Felix left the Palais Wallerstein with the sensation that he had stepped out of a warm painting and into a quiet sketch. The foyer had thinned as midnight passed, and the last guests moved with the softened patience that comes after music has done its work. Attendants returned coats with practiced ease, calling names in low voices, smoothing collars, offering a final courteous nod before each departure. Felix accepted his wool coat and settled it over his shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of cloth and the gentle return of ordinary life. Outside the doors, the night air waited, crisp and clean, and the snow continued to fall with the steady faithfulness of something that did not need applause. He descended the steps and paused for a moment beneath the awning, allowing the cold to clear his thoughts in a single calm breath. Behind him, the Palais still glowed, but the sound of the orchestra had already faded into memory, like a tune one can still hear in the mind after the last note has been played. A driver called softly from a line of fiacres, and Felix approached, giving his address with quiet precision. As the carriage began to roll away, the Ringstrasse unfolded in a different mood than earlier. The lamps were fewer. The windows were dimmer. The city looked as if it were preparing to sleep, pulling its blankets of snow higher over its shoulders. Felix watched the silhouettes of statues and columns pass, and he felt the night settle inside him as a gentle tiredness rather than a heaviness. He did not replay conversations in anxious loops. He did not scrutinize his own awkwardness, as he might have done in younger years. Instead, he allowed the evening to remain what it had been. A circle of warm light, a brief sentence spoken near a window, a name heard like a soft bell, Elizabeth, and then the slow closing of doors. When the carriage stopped at his building, he thanked the driver, climbed the stairs, and entered his apartment with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has done something slightly outside his usual life and has not been harmed by it. He lit his lamp, undressed with unhurried care, and placed his clothes neatly over a chair. The room, after the bright ballroom, seemed smaller, but not lonely. It was gentle in its simplicity. The tea scent had faded. The radiator clicked softly as it cooled. Felix washed his hands in the small basin, the water cold enough to wake him briefly, and then he returned to the main room to put away his gloves and wallet, the small rituals that signaled the end of a day. As he slid his hand into his coat pocket to check for his keys, his fingers met something that was not his own. The object was soft, cool, and unfamiliar, with a shape that made his mind hesitate for a beat before understanding. He drew it out into the lamplight, and the pale leather caught the glow as if it held a faint memory of the ballroom. A glove, an ivory glove, slender and finely made, with delicate embroidery near the wrist that looked, even in this quiet room, like something meant for candlelight. Felix held it carefully, not from fear of damaging it, but from the instinctive respect he had for well-crafted things. The glove felt smooth beneath his fingertips, the leather thin and supple, and he noticed at once that it was not merely an accessory. It had been chosen. It had been worn with intention. He turned it slightly, studying the stitching, the small curve of the fingers, the way the embroidery formed a quiet vine. In the warmth of his apartment, it seemed almost out of place, like a snowflake that had somehow drifted indoors without melting. For a moment he stood still, letting the discovery settle. He tried to recall the exact shape of the evening's last minutes. The foyer, the coats, the murmured goodbyes, the slight press of bodies moving toward the door. He had not picked up a glove consciously. He had not noticed it falling. Yet there it was, undeniable, resting in his hand with an unspoken question. Felix's mind, trained to trace origins and categorize facts, began to work gently. The glove's embroidery matched what he had noticed earlier, pale, refined, and quiet. His thoughts drifted as naturally as a waltz returns to its theme, to the woman in midnight blue, Elisabeth von Lichtenau. He could not be certain. Many women wore pale gloves, but the detail, the small vine at the wrist, pulled his memory into alignment, and a calm certainty took shape. Soft but persistent, he did not feel excitement. He did not imagine grand meanings. Instead, he felt a small, practical concern, and beneath it, something subtler, the sensation that the evening had left him a task, not a burden, but a gentle responsibility. He set the glove on his desk beside the folded invitation, arranging it carefully as if it were a document that needed to be preserved. The ivory leather looked luminous against the dark wood, and Felix found himself staring at it longer than necessary. In his work at the library, he often handled letters written by people who had long since vanished into history. He knew how objects could outlast moments. He knew how a pressed flower in a book could carry a season forward. The glove, in its quiet elegance, felt like that. Something small that carried a trace of warmth and music. He went to bed, and the night passed without disturbance. Snow continued to fall, and in the early hours, the city grew even quieter, as if it were listening to its own breathing. When Felix woke, the light outside was pale and restrained, a winter morning light that did not rush into the room but entered politely. He dressed, warmed a little water for tea, and sat for a moment at his desk, looking at the glove as if he were reading it. He considered the simplest option. He could return it to the palais. An attendant would place it with other lost items, and Elisabeth might retrieve it. Or she might not, depending on pride, forgetfulness, or the simple chaos of days. Felix did not like uncertainty when it could be avoided through a small, courteous action. He also suspected, with a quiet intuition, that gloves were not easily replaced, not when they were this finely made, not when they were chosen to match a dress and an evening and a particular sense of self. Still, he needed to be discreet. He did not wish to appear presumptuous. Vienna had its unspoken rules, and Felix respected them. He decided first to ask Otto, not directly about Elisabeth, but about the lost and found from the ball. It was an ordinary question, a practical one, and it would not require him to reveal more than necessary. After completing a few tasks at the library, returning a folder to its cabinet, signing off on a small inventory list, Speaking briefly with a colleague about a manuscript that needed delicate handling, Felix left earlier than usual and made his way to Otto's office near the Kärntner Strasse. The city, in daylight, looked calmer than it had under chandeliers. Snow lay piled along curbs and on stone ledges, and the air smelled faintly of coal smoke and winter bread. Otto greeted him with cheerful surprise and offered him coffee, which Felix declined in favor of tea, as he always did. Otto's office was warm and crowded with papers that seemed to thrive under his attention, and Otto himself looked as though he were still carrying the glow of the ball. Felix waited until a lull in conversation, then reached into his coat pocket and drew out the glove wrapped in a clean handkerchief, presenting it not as a treasure, but as a practical concern. "I found this last night," Felix said quietly. "It may have belonged to one of the guests. I thought it best to return it properly." Otto's eyebrows rose, and he leaned forward with interest, taking the glove with the kind of casual confidence Felix lacked. He examined it briefly, then smiled in a way that was more amused than intrusive. "You are the only man I know who would treat a glove like a state document," Otto said, not unkindly. "But yes, we should see it returned. These things matter to people." "I would rather it not be left to chance," Felix replied, and his tone held no romance, only certainty. Otto turned the glove, and as he did, his expression shifted from amusement to recognition. He tapped the embroidered wrist lightly, then glanced up. "This looks like von Lichtenau workmanship," he said, as if speaking of a tailor's signature. Elizabeth was there, of course. Her mother is always involved in these benefit events. She would not forget both gloves, but she might forget one, especially at the end. Felix kept his face calm, though his attention sharpened. "Do you know where they might be reached?" he asked. He meant it as simply as it sounded. Otto nodded, already drifting into the practical world he understood best. He moved to a ledger, then to a stack of guest lists. "It should be in the list," he murmured. "Not the full address, perhaps, but enough. If not, I can ask someone." Discreetly, he flipped a page, the paper making a soft sound like a sigh, then traced a line with his finger. "Here we are," he said. "Von Lichtenau. They keep a residence near the Alsergrund, not far from the Servitenviertel. A handsome building, quiet street. I can give you the direction, and the doorman will know. They always know." Felix felt the world narrow into a small, clear point, an address, a street, a way to return what did not belong to him. The glove, which had seemed like an odd accident the night before, now appeared as a reason. Small, plausible, and perfectly polite. He accepted the information with gratitude and restraint, asking only what he needed and no more. Otto, for his part, looked at him with a knowing brightness, but he did not press. He simply handed the glove back, now without the handkerchief, as if returning it to Felix's care was the most natural thing in the world. As Felix stepped back into the winter afternoon, the air felt cleaner than usual. The snow underfoot was crisp, and the city's sounds were softened by white. He held the glove carefully inside his coat pocket, and as he walked, he became aware of how gently life could arrange itself. It did not always arrive with thunder or declarations. Sometimes it arrived in the shape of something small and misplaced, something meant to be returned. Sometimes fate, if it existed at all, wore the modest disguise of courtesy. And Felix, who had always trusted in small acts done correctly, found himself carrying one such act like a quiet lantern, already lighting the way to a door he had not planned to knock on. The following afternoon, Vienna seemed to move as if it had decided to be kind. Snow still lay over the city, but it had softened into a clean, settled layer, rather than the restless fall of the previous night. The sky was pale and steady, and the light that filtered down into the streets had the quiet clarity of winter glass. Felix left the library a little earlier than usual, not in haste, but with a measured intention that made his steps feel slightly different. He had placed the glove inside a small paper envelope lined with tissue, as if preparing a fragile artifact for return to its rightful shelf. The envelope sat in the inner pocket of his coat, close to his chest, and each time his arm moved, he felt the faint reminder of it, not heavy, but present. It was a simple errand, he told himself. It was the ordinary work of returning what was lost. Yet the city, in its calm brightness, seemed to listen as though it understood that small errands sometimes carry a second, quieter meaning. He took a tram for part of the way, sitting near the window as the car glided along tracks that rang softly beneath the wheels. The streets outside were lined with bare trees, whose branches held little clumps of snow, and the facades of buildings looked more intricate in daylight, their carvings and balconies traced in white. Felix watched pedestrians move slowly, collars up, scarves high, each person wrapped in their own private warmth. He thought of the Palais Wallerstein, of chandeliers and waltzes, and it felt distant now, like a dream that had left behind a single object as proof it had occurred. When the tram neared the Alsergrund, he stepped down onto the street and walked the remainder, guided by Otto's directions and by the quiet confidence that the doorman would indeed know. The neighborhood had a gentler pace than the center of the city. It was still Vienna, still dignified, but it felt more lived in, less theatrical. There were small shops with tidy windows, a bakery releasing a steady scent of warm bread, and a corner café where a few customers sat with newspapers spread like sails. Felix moved past them with the calm of someone on a purposeful walk, his breath forming faint clouds that vanished quickly. As he approached the street Otto had described, the buildings grew slightly grander, their entrances framed by stone arches and ironwork gates. Snow rested in the grooves of carved lintels, and the air seemed quieter, as if the street itself preferred to speak softly. The von Lichtenau residence was unmistakable. It stood with the composed elegance of old money, a tall facade of pale stone, windows evenly spaced, curtains drawn in careful symmetry. A wrought iron gate marked the entrance, and beyond it, a short path led to a heavy door polished to a deep shine. Felix paused at the gate, adjusting his gloves and scarf, feeling suddenly aware of the smallness of his task against the solidity of the building. He did not feel unworthy. He felt simply cautious. It mattered to him to do this correctly, to be neither intrusive nor vague. He lifted the iron latch and stepped through, his boots crunching softly on the packed snow. The doorbell was a brass plate with a neat, restrained design. Felix pressed it once. A muted chime sounded within, and then there was a brief interval of silence that felt like held breath. He heard footsteps, measured and unhurried, approaching from inside. The door opened to reveal a doorman in a dark uniform, his posture straight, his expression neutral in the practiced way of someone who stands between private life and the world outside it. His face was not unfriendly. It was simply careful, as though he had learned to weigh each visitor's purpose before allowing it to enter. "Yes?" the doorman asked. Felix offered a polite nod. "Good afternoon," he said. "My name is Felix Adler. I attended the winter ball at the Palais Wallerstein last evening. I found something that may belong to Fräulein Elisabeth von Lichtenau, and I wish to return it." The doorman's eyes lowered briefly, noting Felix's composed manner, the cleanliness of his coat, the sincerity in his tone. Felix did not embellish. He did not offer unnecessary explanation. He simply held his words as one holds a small object, carefully, without flourish. The doorman hesitated for the space of a heartbeat, then inclined his head. "Please wait," he said, and stepped back, leaving the door partially open. Warm air flowed outward, carrying the faint scent of beeswax and something floral, like dried lavender kept in drawers. Felix remained at the threshold, not stepping inside uninvited. He listened to the quiet of the entry hall, the soft echo of footsteps, the distant closing of an inner door, the low murmur of voices. The interval was not long, but it stretched in Felix's perception, becoming a small corridor of anticipation. He reminded himself again that this was only courtesy, that he would return the glove, receive thanks, and leave. Yet beneath that practical outline, he felt a subtle attentiveness gather, the same attentive calm he brought to rare manuscripts. Something about this moment felt delicate. It required gentleness. The doorman returned. "Fräulein von Lichtenau will see you," he said, and opened the door wider, stepping aside. Felix entered the hall with restrained steps, careful not to bring too much snow onto the polished floor. The interior was quiet and warm, furnished with the understated richness of a household that valued continuity. A thick runner muted his footsteps. A tall mirror reflected the hallway in soft light. There were paintings on the walls, landscapes perhaps, or portraits, though Felix saw them only in passing. The doorman guided him to a sitting room and indicated a place to stand or sit, then withdrew, closing the door softly behind him. The sitting room was bright with winter daylight filtered through lace curtains. A fire burned low in the hearth, not roaring, but steady, giving the room a gentle pulse of warmth. The furniture was arranged with calm symmetry, a sofa upholstered in pale fabric, a pair of chairs, a small table with a vase of white flowers. On a sideboard stood a porcelain tea set, its painted details delicate as handwriting. Felix did not sit at once. He remained standing, holding the envelope in his hands, feeling the quiet of the room settle around him like a shawl. He could hear the faint tick of a clock, unhurried, as if time itself had agreed to be polite. Then the door opened, and Elizabeth entered. She was not wearing the midnight blue dress of the ball. Today she wore a simple, well-tailored day dress in a soft gray with a light cardigan over it, and her hair was arranged with the same careful simplicity Felix remembered. The change in clothing did not diminish her presence. If anything, it made her seem more real, less like a figure framed by chandeliers, and more like a person who belonged to quiet rooms and winter mornings. She paused when she saw him, and her expression held the same calm, restrained amusement he had noticed at the ballroom's edge. "Herr Adler," she said, as if the doorman had offered his name, and she had placed it neatly into her memory. Felix inclined his head. "Fräulein von Lichtenau," he replied. "Thank you for receiving me." Her gaze fell briefly to the envelope in his hands, and something softened in her eyes. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. "You found it," she said, and her tone made it clear that she already knew what it was without needing it named. "Yes," Felix answered, and held the envelope forward. "I noticed it only after I returned home. I thought it best to bring it directly." Elizabeth stepped closer, and Felix saw the fine details of her face more clearly. The calm line of her eyebrows, the gentle clarity of her eyes, the faint warmth in her cheeks from the fire or from the winter air she had crossed to come here. She took the envelope with careful fingers and opened it slowly, as though she were unwrapping something meaningful, even if it was small. When she drew out the glove, Felix watched her hands, ungloved now, touch the pale leather with a quiet familiarity. She did not laugh at her forgetfulness. She did not dramatize it. She simply held the glove, then looked up at him. "I'm grateful," she said. Her voice was low and even. "It seems I left more than I intended in the palais." The room was full of turning. Felix replied before he could stop himself. And as soon as the words left him, he felt a faint heat rise beneath his collar. He had repeated her phrase from the previous night, and he was not sure whether it would sound charming or foolish. Elizabeth's eyes widened slightly, then her smile appeared fully, gentle and unmistakable. It was not laughter at him. It was recognition of herself, of the shared moment, of the quiet humor in the world's small coincidences. "Yes," she said softly. It was. The warmth of that brief exchange settled between them, neither heavy nor urgent. Felix felt his own shoulders relax by a fraction, as though the room had granted him permission to be natural. Elizabeth moved to the tea table with the glove still in her hand and set it down carefully beside the porcelain, as if placing it back into order. She did not rush to end the visit. She did not, however, prolong it theatrically either. Instead, she looked at Felix with a thoughtful steadiness. "You went to the trouble," she said. "Most people would have left it with the attendants." "I considered that," Felix replied, "but I thought it might be simpler and more certain to return it personally." "A certainty is a rare comfort," Elizabeth said, and the way she spoke made the phrase feel less like a general truth and more like a private thought offered gently. She paused, then added, "Would you take tea? You've come through the cold." Felix hesitated, not because he did not want to, but because accepting would turn this errand into something more than an errand. Yet refusing felt unnecessarily rigid, as though he were afraid of warmth. He nodded once. "If it is not an inconvenience," he said. "It is not," Elizabeth replied, and she rang a small bell on the table with a light touch as they waited for the tea to be brought properly. Though everything in the room suggested tea could be arranged with effortless grace, Felix found himself standing in a quiet space between intention and accident. He had come to return a glove. He had done so. Yet now, in the calm brightness of the sitting room, with the fire's gentle crackle and Elizabeth's composed presence, the small reason that had brought him here began to take on a new shape. It was still polite, still plausible, still modest, but it was also, unmistakably, a doorway. And Felix, who had always lived among careful margins and preserved words, felt the soft possibility of a new chapter opening without any need to announce itself. Tea arrived with a quiet efficiency that seemed woven into the house itself. A maid set the tray down without fuss, poured the amber liquid into delicate cups, and withdrew as silently as she had appeared. Felix and Elizabeth sat opposite each other with the gentle formality of two people who understood the comfort of manners, and yet the atmosphere did not feel stiff. The fire in the hearth kept a steady, low voice, and the daylight through lace curtains softened the edges of everything it touched. Elizabeth spoke first, asking after Felix's work with a calm curiosity that did not feel like polite obligation. When Felix told her of the National Library, of letters whose ink had faded to brown, of bindings that smelled faintly of dust and lavender, of the careful patience required to preserve what time tried to erase, she listened as if he were describing a landscape she might one day visit. Her attention was quiet but complete, and Felix found himself speaking a little more than he usually did, not because he wished to impress, but because her listening made each sentence feel welcome. Their talk remained simple, as though both were careful not to step too quickly into intimacy. Felix mentioned a winter exhibition at the library, a small display of illuminated manuscripts, and Elizabeth responded with a remark about how even old pages could hold light, which struck him as both poetic and practical. She spoke of her mother's involvement with charitable committees and how the winter season always brought a particular flurry of events, yet she spoke without complaint, as if responsibility were simply another form of rhythm. When the conversation returned, inevitably and gently, to the glove, Elizabeth smiled and admitted she had searched her cloak pockets at home before realizing it was truly gone, then decided not to send anyone back to the Palais at that late hour. "I told myself," she said, "that if it was meant to return, it would." The words were calm, not mystical, yet they rested in the room with a soft weight, and Felix understood that her patience was not laziness, but trust in small unfoldings. When he took his leave, he did so with care. He thanked her for the tea, and she thanked him again for the courtesy that had brought him to her door. At the threshold, where warm air met cold, Elizabeth paused with her hand on the edge of the door and looked at him as if measuring the moment's proper shape. "Herr Adler," she said, "Vienna is full of turning, but sometimes it brings people back to the same place." The sentence was offered lightly, almost as a reflection, and yet Felix felt it settle into him like a bookmark placed gently between pages. He nodded, not trusting himself to add unnecessary words, and stepped out into the winter, the street quiet beneath fresh snow. In the days that followed, he returned to his routines with the familiar steadiness he trusted. The library's rooms were cool and dry, their silence punctuated by the soft sounds of paper and footsteps. Felix catalogued, repaired, and preserved, keeping his mind on tidy lists and careful handwriting. Yet now, beneath the surface of those tasks, there was a faint thread of expectation, not sharp, not impatient, simply present. He did not tell himself he would see Elizabeth again. He did not plan routes with the hope of accident. He merely carried the memory of her sitting room's firelight and the gentle confidence in her voice, like warmth held in a pocket. When winter afternoons dimmed and the lamps were lit early, he sometimes found himself thinking of the lace curtains, the porcelain tea set, and the pale glove resting beside it, returned to its place as naturally as a word returned to its proper line. A week passed. Snow came and went in soft cycles, and Vienna moved through them with the calm competence of an old city that had seen many winters. One late afternoon, Felix left the library and walked along a street near the Universität, intending to stop at a small bookseller he favored. The shop was narrow and deep, smelling of ink and bindings, and its owner, an elderly man with spectacles that always seemed on the verge of slipping, kept a small table by the window for new poetry. Felix stepped inside, greeted the owner, and began to browse with the slow pleasure of someone who knew that choosing a book was not a purchase, but a kind of conversation. As he reached for a slim volume of Rilke, he heard the soft sound of the doorbell behind him. He did not look up at once. He continued reading the back cover, letting the words settle. Then, as if the air itself had shifted, he lifted his gaze and saw Elizabeth standing just inside the doorway, her coat dusted with snow, her cheeks touched with cold. She was not dressed for a ball. She wore a simple hat and a dark wool wrap, and her gloves today were again pale, though perhaps not the same pair, and they made her hands look like winter lilies against the darker fabric. She paused as she noticed him, and for a moment her expression held the same restrained amusement he remembered from their first near collision by the ballroom window. "Herr Adler," she said softly, as if the books required quiet. "Fräulein von Lichtenau," Felix replied, and his voice was equally low, matching the room's hush. Elizabeth glanced toward the shelves, then back to him. "Do you come here often?" she asked. and there was a faint humor in the question, as if they both understood that often might be one of Vienna's gentler disguises. "Sometimes," Felix said, "when I need something quiet and new." "Yes," Elizabeth answered, and her eyes moved over the spines as though she were scanning for comfort. "Quiet and new. That is a good combination." They spoke briefly, not as strangers, yet not as intimates. Felix mentioned the manuscript exhibition he had referred to during tea, and Elizabeth admitted she had considered visiting, but had not yet found the right afternoon. He offered, without overthinking, that the exhibition would remain for another month, and that the light in the display room was particularly kind in late day. Elizabeth nodded and said she would remember. Then, before the conversation could become an event, she selected a book, an essay collection neatly bound, and smiled again, the smile that seemed to keep the world gentle around it. "Vienna is full of turning," she said, and her tone suggested this was becoming their quiet refrain. Felix answered, "Yes," and felt, with a small inward surprise, that the word was enough. After she left, the shop seemed warmer, as if her presence had carried in a small pocket of firelight. Felix purchased his book and stepped outside into the dimming street. Snowflakes fell, light and slow, and the lamps were beginning to glow again. He walked home with the calm sensation that something had been confirmed, not loudly, but steadily, that their meeting at the von Lichtenau residence had not been sealed away as a single courtesy. It had become a small hinge, allowing the next door to open without force. Another meeting came, as gently as the first. It was near a florist's stand in the Servitenviertel, where winter roses and evergreen branches were arranged in careful abundance. Felix had stopped to buy a small bunch of white carnations for his aunt, an old habit of gratitude he maintained without ceremony. He was considering whether a sprig of pine might make the bouquet too festive when he heard a familiar voice behind him, soft as fabric brushing fabric. "You choose as though the flowers must pass an examination." Felix turned and saw Elizabeth beside him, her scarf drawn snug against the cold. She looked at the carnations with mild approval, then at the florist's winter roses, her gaze lingering as if she were listening to them. Felix's embarrassment was brief and gentle. It dissolved quickly in the warmth of her tone. "I suppose I do," he admitted. "I do not like to bring the wrong thing." Elizabeth's smile appeared. "In Vienna, the wrong thing is often only the right thing in the wrong season," she said. She reached out, not to touch the flowers, but to gesture lightly toward a cluster of pale roses whose petals were edged in faint pink, like dawn on snow. "Those," she added, "look like they have learned patience." Felix followed her gaze and felt his own thoughts soften. They spoke a little longer than they had in the bookshop, and though the conversation remained simple, winter, errands, the comfort of warm rooms, it carried a growing ease. The glove was mentioned again, not directly, but as a shared understanding. "You have a talent," Elizabeth said, "for finding what is misplaced." Felix replied that he only noticed what others overlooked, and she tilted her head as if considering the difference between those two things. Before they parted, she mentioned almost casually that she had indeed been thinking of the library exhibition. "Perhaps," she said, "you will tell me which afternoon has the kindest light." It was not an invitation, not exactly. It was a suggestion wrapped in practicality, the way Vienna wrapped warmth in wool. Felix answered with the same gentleness. "Whenever you wish," he said. "The pages will be there," and so the city continued to arrange them in small, unhurried repetitions. Sometimes it was a glimpse across a café window, Elizabeth seated inside with a cup before her, Felix passing outside with his collar turned up, both noticing, both smiling faintly without stopping. Sometimes it was the shared pause at a street corner as a tram passed, their eyes meeting briefly above the moving crowd. Each meeting was a thread, thin but steady, weaving something that did not demand a name. Felix began to understand the shape of this quiet unfolding. It was not romance arriving with sudden force, but familiarity growing like snow on rooftops, layer by layer, until one day it would be simply there, part of the city's winter outline. He did not hurry it. Elizabeth did not hurry it. They allowed each small reason to be what it was, a reason to speak, to exchange a thought, to let the world feel slightly softer than it had the moment before. The glove story remained their gentle beginning, a modest password that proved they had once been brought together by something as simple as loss and return. And beneath that modesty, something else began to take shape. The calm recognition that some meetings, when repeated with patience, become less like coincidence and more like a quiet, steady choice. Winter in Vienna had a way of making intentions feel gentler. The cold narrowed the world to essentials: warm rooms, steady light, the simple relief of holding something hot between one's hands. And in that narrowing, small decisions became easier to make. After the meeting at the florist's stand, Felix found himself thinking less about whether he should see Elizabeth again, and more about how naturally the city kept placing them within the same quiet radius. It seemed almost wasteful to pretend surprise each time. The thought was not bold, it was simply honest. So when, on a late afternoon softened by falling snow, he happened to pass the café where he had once seen her through the fogged glass, he paused, not in hesitation, but in recognition, and stepped inside as though following a familiar tune. The café was old in the comforting way, with dark wood paneling that held the warmth of many winters. Mirrors along the walls reflected rows of small lamps, making the room appear deeper than it was, and the air carried a gentle mixture of coffee, wax, and pastry. There was also cinnamon, faint but unmistakable, rising from a tray of freshly baked strudel that a waiter carried past with careful hands. The windows were clouded with steam, blurring the street outside into a watercolor of passing coats and white snow. Felix took off his gloves slowly, feeling his fingertips wake in the warmth, and chose a table near the window where he could watch the quiet world beyond without being in it. He had not come with a plan. He did not scan the room anxiously. He simply settled, ordered tea, and opened the slim volume he had purchased at the bookseller. Yet his attention, always attuned to small shifts, noticed almost at once the soft change in the room's atmosphere when Elizabeth entered. It was not dramatic. No one turned in unison. It was more like the way a room notices when a candle is lit. Subtle, but real. She stepped inside, brushing snow from her coat with calm movements, and paused briefly at the entrance as if letting her eyes adjust to the amber light. Her scarf was a pale, creamy color that echoed her gloves, and there was a faint flush in her cheeks as though winter had kissed her in passing. When she saw Felix, her expression changed with gentle ease, the faint surprise dissolving into a quiet smile that suggested she had, in some private place, expected this turning. "Herr Adler?" she said as she approached his table, her voice low in respect for the café's hush. "Fräulein von Lichtenau," Felix replied, and stood briefly, not from rigid etiquette, but from the natural courtesy that rose in him around her. She gestured lightly toward the chair opposite. "May I?" she asked, though the question felt like a small ceremony rather than a real uncertainty. "Of course," Felix said, and as she sat, the space between them seemed to settle into balance, as if the table had been waiting for exactly this arrangement. For a moment, they spoke of simple things: the weather's steadiness, the way Vienna's snow had a different softness this year, the comfort of cafés as winter shelters. A waiter arrived, and Elizabeth ordered coffee with a calm familiarity, while Felix requested his tea and, almost without thinking, added a slice of apple strudel, to share if she wishes. Elizabeth's eyes warmed at that, not in delight exactly, but in appreciation of the gentle practicality of offering. The waiter departed, and the cafe's sounds returned to the foreground. The soft clink of cups, the murmur of conversation, the distant rustle of newspaper pages turned slowly. When the tea and coffee arrived, steam rose in slow spirals. The scent of bergamot mingled with roasted beans and cinnamon, and Felix found that the air itself seemed to breathe more softly. Elizabeth held her cup with both hands for a moment, before drinking, as if receiving warmth with gratitude. Felix watched her in the way he watched rare pages, without taking, without rushing, simply noticing. She had an unhurried composure that made even small gestures feel deliberate. When she looked up, she caught his gaze without discomfort. "You mentioned the library," she said, as if continuing a conversation that had never truly ended. "The exhibition. I have been thinking of it." Felix nodded. "It is quiet," he said. "Not grand, not like a ball, but there is beauty in it. The kind that does not demand attention." Elizabeth smiled, and the smile was small but complete. "That is often the kind of beauty I trust," she replied. They spoke then of old things and new things, and how both could belong to a winter afternoon. Felix described the careful hands of restorers, the patience required to repair a torn page without changing its story. He spoke of ink that had once been black and now lived as brown, of marginal notes left by readers long dead, their thoughts still present like footprints in snow. Elizabeth listened, and as she listened, she occasionally asked a question that was not clever for its own sake, but quietly precise, as though she wanted to see the world as Felix saw it, not merely to be entertained by his words. She admitted, in turn, that her life often felt full of events that looked bright from the outside and tiring from the inside, and that she cherished places where she could be simply a person rather than a name. Felix understood that without needing it explained further. Names carried weight in Vienna. They opened doors and closed them. They could be comforting or suffocating depending on the day. When the strudel arrived, the cinnamon rose more strongly, and Elizabeth laughed softly at the sight of the generous slice. "Winter requires certain allowances," she said, and Felix agreed, feeling the quiet pleasure of sharing something sweet without it becoming a performance. They ate slowly. Outside the window, snow continued to fall, and the figures on the street passed like drifting shadows. Inside, warmth gathered around the small circle of their table, and Felix realized with mild surprise that he was not thinking about the passage of time at all. He was simply there, present in the moment, as though the café had softened the edges of his usual caution. Elizabeth spoke, after a pause, of winter roses, the ones she had pointed out at the florist's stand. She described how her mother insisted on fresh flowers even in the coldest months, as if the household could not bear the idea of dormancy. "But I prefer the quiet branches," Elizabeth admitted. "The evergreens, the pine. They smell honest. They do not pretend it is spring." Felix heard something deeper in that preference, not sadness, but clarity. He told her, in response, about the scent of old books, how it was not a single smell, but a whole history. Dust, glue, dried herbs tucked into pages, sometimes a faint trace of perfume that had survived decades. Elizabeth's eyes grew thoughtful. "Then the library is full of ghosts," she said gently. "Not ghosts," Felix replied, and his voice was calm. "Echoes, like music remembered after the instruments have stopped." She considered that, and the silence between them felt comfortable rather than empty. In that pause, Felix became aware again of the glove, of the small chain of causes and effects that had brought them to this table. He did not mention it directly, yet it was present like a quiet third companion. Elizabeth, perhaps sensing the same thread, glanced down at her own hands resting near her cup. Today her gloves were neatly folded in her lap, removed for warmth. She touched the fabric once, lightly, as if acknowledging the story without naming it. "It is strange," she said softly, "how we accept certain reasons and not others. If I had simply wished to speak to you after the ball, it might have felt too forward, too abrupt. But a glove..." Her voice trailed off with a small, self-aware smile. "A glove is safe," Felix said, and the words came without calculation. "It is small enough that it does not frighten the world." Elizabeth's smile deepened, and her eyes held a quiet brightness. "Yes," she agreed. "Small enough, and yet it can change the shape of an evening." Felix did not answer at once. The truth of her remark settled in him, not as a spark, but as a steady warmth. He felt, suddenly, how gently fate could behave if it chose. It did not always arrive as a storm. Sometimes it arrived as an object misplaced in the calm churn of departures, offering an excuse that felt harmless, while opening a door that mattered. Felix had spent his life respecting small details, and now one small detail had rearranged his days into something softer. They spoke a while longer, and the conversation drifted like steam, light, curling, never rushing. They discussed music, and Elizabeth admitted she could not resist a waltz, even when she pretended she could. Felix confessed that he listened to the radio at night, and that certain pieces made the city feel closer, as if Vienna's streets were singing quietly to themselves. Elizabeth told him she sometimes sat by the window late in the evening, watching snow fall under the lamps, because it made her feel that the world was capable of gentleness. Felix found himself saying that he understood, and he meant it. When they finally rose to leave, the café had grown slightly dimmer, lamps glowing brighter against the deepening afternoon. Felix paid without fuss, and Elizabeth did not protest. There was a quiet equality in accepting the gesture as simply part of the rhythm. At the door, they paused, both pulling on gloves, both wrapping scarves with slow care. The cold outside waited, but it no longer felt harsh. It felt clean and awake. Snow touched their shoulders lightly as they stepped onto the street together. They walked for a short distance before their paths separated, and at the corner where Elizabeth turned toward her street, she paused and looked back. "Thank you," she said, not only for the tea or the strudel, but for the calm of the afternoon itself. Felix inclined his head. "Until next time," he said, and the phrase was gentle, not presumptuous. It was spoken with the quiet confidence of someone who had begun to trust the city's soft repetitions. Elizabeth's smile was her answer. She turned and walked away, her steps unhurried, her figure gradually blending into the falling snow. Felix remained for a moment, watching the place where she had been, feeling the warmth of the café still lingering in him like cinnamon on the breath. Then he, too, began to walk, carrying with him the simple, steady sense that winter had given him something unexpected, not a grand event, but a quiet companionship, unfolding at the pace of snow. Vienna's winter did not loosen its hold quickly. It lingered in the corners of the day, in the pale light that arrived late and departed early, in the way the city seemed to lower its voice beneath the snow. After the afternoon at the café, Felix felt a quiet steadiness settle into his weeks, as though something inside him had found a gentle rhythm and chosen to keep it. He did not wake each morning with dramatic anticipation. He did not count hours, yet he moved through his days with a soft awareness, like someone carrying a warm stone in his pocket, small, reassuring, and always there. Elizabeth did not become the subject of fevered thought. She became a presence that softened the world at its edges. And Felix, who had always trusted the slow accrual of meaning, allowed it to happen without forcing it into a shape too soon. Their meetings continued, sometimes arranged, sometimes appearing as if by the city's quiet design. They returned to the café once, then again, each time choosing the same table near the fogged window, as though it were a modest stage for a calm conversation. The waiter began to recognize them, offering tea without being asked, and placing a small dish of sugar between them as if it belonged to the table itself. On other days, they walked along streets where snow had been pushed into neat piles, pausing to watch a tram glide past or to admire a shop window arranged with winter linens. Their talk remained gentle, never urgent, the way winter itself never rushed. They spoke of books and music, of the small comforts of warm rooms, of how Vienna could feel like an old song, familiar, layered, always repeating certain themes. One evening, as the city's lamps were lit early and the air outside had the crisp clarity of polished glass, Felix invited Elizabeth to visit the library exhibition he had mentioned. The invitation was offered simply, without ceremony, during a conversation about illuminated manuscripts and the way gold leaf seemed to catch light even when the day was dim. Elizabeth paused with her cup near her lips, considering, and then nodded, as if the decision had been waiting patiently behind her thoughts. "Yes," she said, "I would like that. I would like to see pages that have remembered light." They met the following afternoon at the entrance of the National Library. The building's exterior stood solid and dignified, its stone facade touched by winter's pale sheen. Inside, the air was cooler than in the cafes, dry with the careful climate required to protect paper, older than both of them. Felix greeted the attendant at the desk with a nod and led Elizabeth through corridors that smelled faintly of polished wood and dust, held at bay by diligence. The exhibition room was small, discreet, and softly lit, designed so the pages could be seen without being harmed. Glass cases held manuscripts open like sleeping birds with wings spread gently, their ink lines delicate and patient, their margins decorated with vines, stars, and tiny figures. Elizabeth moved slowly from case to case, her posture calm, her hands folded loosely before her, as though she did not wish to disturb the stillness. Felix stood beside her, not lecturing, simply offering small explanations when she paused. He pointed out the difference between inks, the way certain blues were made from groundstone, the way gold leaf had been pressed thin as breath. Elizabeth listened, her eyes quiet and intent. Occasionally, she would lean slightly closer to a case, studying a letter shape or a small painted flower, and Felix felt an almost tender satisfaction in seeing her attention, because it was the kind of attention he respected most. It was not consumption. It was companionship with an object, a patient meeting of gaze and meaning. Near the final case, a manuscript lay open to a page bordered with delicate vines, and in the center, a line of music was written, neumes and notes, careful and dark. Felix noticed Elizabeth's gaze linger there longer than on the others. "You read music?" he asked softly. "A little," she said, "enough to recognize what I cannot play." Felix smiled faintly. "This is a dance," he said. "Not a waltz, older than that. But you can see how even the page expects movement." Elizabeth's eyes warmed. "Yes," she murmured. "The page is still, but it implies turning," Felix said, and as soon as he spoke, he realized the word had become part of their shared language, as familiar as their greetings. The room was full of turning. The city is full of turning. And now even the page implies turning. Elizabeth glanced at him with a small, pleased expression, as if the repetition was comforting rather than tiresome. They stood in the hush of the exhibition room, surrounded by old light, and Felix felt a curious sense of alignment. The work he had always loved, the quiet beauty he had always trusted, and this new companionship that understood it without needing persuasion. Afterward, they stepped out into the late afternoon. The sky was already deepening toward dusk, and the air outside the library felt sharper after the controlled dryness within. They walked along the street in silence for a few moments, as if letting the images settle behind their eyes. Gold leaf, blue ink, a line of music sleeping under glass. Snow began to fall again, light and slow, and Vienna's lamps cast soft halos that turned each flake into a drifting spark. They reached a small square where an elderly man played a violin beneath an awning, his case open at his feet. The melody was not loud. It moved gently through the air, carried by the winter's stillness. Felix and Elizabeth paused at the edge of the square, not intruding, simply listening. The piece was familiar, a waltz that had been fashionable years earlier, still lingering in the city like a favorite story told again and again. The violin's notes were slightly thin, yet the tenderness in the player's bowing made the music feel intimate, like something whispered rather than performed. Elizabeth's gaze grew distant, and Felix understood that she was not only hearing the melody, but remembering. After the final phrase, when the violinist lowered his bow and the last note faded into the snow, Elizabeth spoke quietly. "That was the waltz," she said. "From the ball." Felix nodded. "Yes," he answered. "I recognize it too." Elizabeth looked at him then, her eyes reflecting the street lamp's glow. "It is strange," she said softly, "how music can hold a room even after we leave it. How it can carry a moment back to us when we least expect it." Felix felt the truth of that settle in him. The ballroom, the chandeliers, the near collision by the window, the glove, the phrase she had spoken. All of it returned, not as a dramatic wave, but as a gentle layer added to the present moment. He could almost feel the polished floor beneath his shoes again, hear the orchestra's careful breathing between phrases. He could see Elizabeth in midnight blue, standing by the flowers, as if she had been placed there by the season itself. "The waltz is a kind of memory," Felix said, and his voice was calm. "It repeats, but each repetition is slightly different." Elizabeth's smile appeared, quiet and warm. "Like our meetings," she said, and the words were not flirtation, not a declaration, simply a true observation offered with ease. They began to walk again, and the city's rhythm seemed to match their steps. Snowflakes touched their coats lightly, then vanished. The lamp's halos made the street feel like a corridor of soft light leading nowhere urgent. Felix noticed, as they passed a row of bare trees, that Elizabeth's gloves were pale again. She wore them neatly, and the small embroidery at the wrist was visible in the lamp glow. The detail stirred a gentle amusement in him. The glove story, once an accident, had become a quiet emblem, something neither of them needed to mention too often, because it was already understood. When they reached the corner where Elizabeth would turn toward her residence, she paused as if reluctant to break the calm of the walk. The street was quiet, the snow steady, and the city seemed to hold its breath in a kind of benevolent stillness. Felix, too, paused, feeling the moment's softness. He did not want to make it heavy with words. He did not want to press meaning onto it like a stamp. Yet he felt a truth rising, gentle but persistent, that their companionship was becoming something that could no longer be described as mere coincidence. Elizabeth looked up at him, and her voice, when she spoke, was almost a whisper beneath the snow. "Do you ever wish," she asked, "that the ball could be repeated? Not the whole event, not the crowd, just the waltz, the turning, the feeling of being carried without effort." Felix considered. In the library, he spent his days preserving what had already happened, keeping it intact so others could approach it later. He understood the desire to repeat beauty, to hold it steady. Yet he also understood that repetition was never exact. It was always a new moment wearing an old shape. "I think," he said slowly, "we repeat it already, in smaller ways. When we meet at a café, when we pause to listen to a violin, when we remember." Elizabeth's expression softened, and for a moment she seemed almost relieved, as if his words had released her from the need to make the thought larger than it was. "Yes," she said, "smaller ways. Perhaps those are kinder." Felix nodded. "Kinder," he echoed, and the word felt right. They stood there for another heartbeat. Two figures beneath a street lamp, the snow falling around them like slow lace. Then Elizabeth inclined her head. "Until soon," she said, and the phrase carried a quiet certainty now, not a hope. "Until soon," Felix replied. As she turned and walked away, Felix watched her for a moment, not possessively, but with the calm attention he gave to anything he valued. Her steps were unhurried, her figure steady, and the pale gloves moved lightly at her sides as she disappeared into the softened street. Felix remained where he was until she had turned the corner, then began to walk home through the snow. On the way, the waltz returned to him again, not as a loud melody, but as a faint inner hum. He realized, with gentle clarity, that their story was not built from dramatic declarations. It was built from repetitions, small meetings, shared listening, quiet observations offered like warm tea. It was built the way winter builds a landscape, slowly, patiently, layer by layer, until the world looks different and one can hardly remember what it looked like before. And in that soft unfolding, Felix felt something he had not expected when he first stepped into the Palais Wallerstein, the calm sense of being carried, without force, into a new kind of warmth. As January leaned toward its later days, Vienna seemed to settle into a deeper kind of winter, the sort that does not merely decorate the city, but changes its pace. The streets remained bright with snow in the mornings and dim with lamp glow by late afternoon, and the air carried a steady crispness that made each breath feel deliberate. Felix found that his own life had begun to take on a similar steadiness, as though the season had taught him to move more slowly and to notice more carefully. The library, with its controlled quiet and its patient pages, remained the center of his days. Yet now there was a thread running through the hours, light but unbreakable. Elizabeth and the gentle continuation of their meetings. He had not expected companionship to arrive in such a modest shape, and perhaps because it was modest, it did not disturb his world. It did not demand that he become someone else. It simply invited him to be more present. One afternoon, after they had left the café and walked part of the way together beneath a slow fall of snow, Elizabeth paused at a corner and laughed softly, as if at a private joke. Felix looked at her with quiet curiosity, and she lifted her hand slightly, showing her gloves. Pale, embroidered, neatly fitted. "I have become suspicious," she said, her voice warm with restrained humor. "Every time I put them on, I think, will these return to me? Or will they decide to choose a new path?" Felix felt a smile rise, gentle and surprised. "Perhaps they like walking," he said. "Perhaps they do not wish to remain still." Elizabeth's eyes brightened. "Or perhaps they have learned that being lost can be useful," she replied, and the way she spoke made the sentence sound less like jest and more like a quiet philosophy offered in passing. She turned her wrists slightly, so the embroidery caught the lamp glow. "I have even considered stitching my name inside them," she added, as if that could persuade them to behave. Felix's smile deepened. "Names are persuasive," he said, then paused and added with calm honesty, "but not always to the things we expect." Elizabeth looked at him with that thoughtful steadiness he had come to recognize. The city around them was quiet, the snow soft underfoot, and the passing of a tram in the distance made a low, comforting sound. Her expression did not change dramatically. It simply softened, as though she had heard something true and had chosen to keep it. "Yes," she said. "Not always." It was soon after that exchange that the glove lingered again, though this time in a different way. It happened without spectacle, as these things seemed to happen between them. They had met at a small stationery shop near the Graben, a place that smelled of paper and ink and faintly of cedar from the wooden drawers. Felix had come to purchase new labels for archival boxes, and Elizabeth had been selecting a simple set of writing paper, cream-colored with a fine texture that invited careful words. They spoke quietly as they stood near the counter, commenting on the beauty of a well-made envelope, the pleasure of a pen that glides easily. Outside, snow drifted past the window like slow feathers. Inside, the shop's lamps made the paper glow softly, as if each sheet already held a story waiting. When Elizabeth left, she had a small parcel in her hand, and Felix walked with her for a short distance, their footsteps matching in unhurried rhythm. At the corner where they parted, she adjusted her scarf, nodded, and turned away. Felix continued toward the library, his thoughts returning gently to his work. It was only later, as he hung his coat in his office and reached into his pocket for his keys, that he felt it again, the soft, cool shape of leather that was not his own. He drew it out slowly, and there, resting in his hand like a familiar refrain, was a pale glove. This time, he did not feel surprise as sharply. He felt something like amused tenderness, and beneath it, a quiet awe at how insistently the world repeated itself. The glove was not identical to the first. Its embroidery was similar, but not the same. The pattern slightly different, like a variation on a theme. Felix held it under the desk lamp, and the pale leather looked luminous against the darker wood. He imagined Elizabeth removing her gloves in the stationery shop, perhaps slipping one into a pocket without noticing the other had stayed behind. Or perhaps it had simply fallen, light as a thought, into the fold of his coat during their brief farewell. The mechanism did not matter. The result did. He placed the glove carefully in the same tissue-lined envelope he had saved, as if the universe had provided him with props for this small play and expected him to reuse them. Then he sat for a moment, hands resting on the desk, and allowed himself to consider what this repetition meant. He did not leap to romance as if it were a destination he had to reach quickly. He did not interpret it as a command. Yet he could not ignore the gentle symbolism that had begun to gather around the gloves. They had become a pattern, and patterns, Felix knew, were rarely meaningless. In manuscripts, repetition indicated emphasis. In music, it indicated a return. In life, perhaps, It indicated that something wished to be noticed. He did not wait long to return it. Not because he was impatient, but because the act itself had become part of their rhythm. The next afternoon, he went to the von Lichtenau residence again. The same quiet street, the same wrought iron gate, the same polished door. The doorman recognized him at once and nodded with a faint, respectful smile that suggested Felix had already been placed in the category of expected visitors, though perhaps only marginally. Felix's heart did not race. His hands did not tremble. He simply held the envelope with calm care and stepped into the warmth of the entry hall. As if entering a familiar chapter, Elizabeth received him in the sitting room again, and this time there was less formality in the air, not because manners had been abandoned, but because familiarity had eased the edges. She wore a soft green dress, and her hair was pinned back with a simple comb. When she saw the envelope in Felix's hands, she did not look shocked. Instead, she looked as though she had been waiting for the universe to complete a sentence. "No," she said softly, and then she laughed, a quiet, warm sound like a bell heard through snow. It happened again. Felix offered the envelope with a faint smile of his own. "It seems your gloves have strong opinions," he replied. Elizabeth took the envelope, opened it, and drew out the glove. She held it up as if examining a curious creature. "They are disobedient," she said, then glanced at Felix. "Or perhaps they are loyal to the wrong person." Felix felt a gentle warmth rise, not sharp, not embarrassing, simply human. "Perhaps they are loyal to the story," he said, surprising himself with the phrase. Elizabeth's expression softened at once, and for a moment her gaze held his with a quiet steadiness that felt like the center of a waltz, calm, balanced, unhurried. "Yes," she said, "to the story." Tea was served again, and this time it felt less like a courtesy and more like a continuation. They spoke of small things, as they often did: winter errands, books, the slow turning of the season. Yet beneath those small things, a deeper understanding had begun to form, and it colored their words even when it remained unspoken. The glove lay on the table beside Elizabeth's cup, pale against the dark wood, an unassuming witness to their conversation. Felix found himself watching it now and then, as if expecting it to move on its own. Elizabeth noticed his glances and smiled. "I wonder," she said, her voice thoughtful, "if we rely on these small reasons because they feel safer than truth." Felix held his cup, feeling its warmth seep slowly into his hands. He considered his answer carefully, not because he wished to hide, but because he wanted to be accurate. "Small reasons are gentle," he said. "They allow us to approach without frightening ourselves." Elizabeth's eyes remained on him. "And what is the truth?" she asked softly. "That we might frighten?" Felix felt the question settle in the room like snow settling on a branch, quiet, inevitable, delicate. He did not rush to answer. He looked at Elizabeth, at the calm line of her mouth, at the steadiness of her gaze, and he understood that she was not demanding a confession. She was simply naming the shape of what was already there. "The truth," Felix said at last, his voice low and even, "is that I am grateful for each small reason, because it means I can see you again. And each time, it feels more natural." Elizabeth did not look away. Her expression did not turn dramatic. Instead, she seemed to breathe more easily, as if his honesty had made the air clearer. "Yes," she said, and her voice was almost a whisper. "It does." Outside the window, snow continued to fall in slow, steady flakes. The fire in the hearth made small sounds, like pages turning. The clock ticked with unhurried patience. In that quiet room, the glove became something more than an object. It became a sign, not loud, not mystical, but gently persistent, a reminder that connection often arrives disguised as practicality, and that fate, if it exists, may prefer to be modest. When Felix left the residence that day, Elizabeth accompanied him to the door, a small departure that felt like another step in their growing ease. At the threshold, she paused, her gloved hands resting lightly together. "Perhaps," she said, her tone half amused, half thoughtful, "I should be more careful." Felix smiled. "Perhaps," he agreed. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "Or perhaps you should trust that what returns is meant to." Elizabeth's eyes warmed, and she nodded once, slowly, as if accepting a promise that had not been spoken as one. "Yes," she said. "Perhaps that is the better way." Felix stepped out into the winter afternoon, the snow cool on his cheeks, the street quiet and bright. He walked with an unhurried pace, feeling the calm certainty of something taking root. The gloves had begun as an accident, then became a reason. And now, with their gentle repetition, they felt almost like a promise that their story would continue, not because either of them forced it forward, but because the world itself seemed willing to offer them small openings again and again, until the path between them became simply the way things were. After the second glove returned to Elizabeth's table like a familiar refrain, their days began to gather a new kind of texture. It was not a sudden transformation, not a dramatic shift from acquaintance to declaration, but a quiet thickening of the thread that already held them. Felix noticed it first in the way he anticipated her voice, not as a hunger, but as a calm readiness. Elizabeth noticed it, perhaps, in the way certain streets no longer felt like mere routes through the city, but like corridors that might lead to a meeting. Winter in Vienna remained steady, and within that steadiness their connection took on small rituals, gentle, practical, almost ordinary, until it was difficult to say where coincidence ended and intention began. It began, fittingly, with paper. Felix, whose life was shaped by documents and careful margins, had always believed that writing carried a different kind of truth than speaking. Words spoken could drift away into air. Words written stayed. They could be reread in a different light. They could be held like an object. After an afternoon with Elizabeth, he found himself at his desk later that evening, the lamp's glow soft against the dark of the room, thinking of something she had said about old pages remembering light. He did not want to create a heavy letter. He did not want to imitate poetry when simplicity would do. Yet he felt, calmly and clearly, that he wished to leave her a line of his own, something small, like the reasons that had brought them together. He selected a sheet of plain cream paper and wrote with his neat, restrained hand, "Fräulein von Lichtenau. If you find yourself near the library one afternoon this week, the exhibition room will be open until 5. The light is kindest around 4 when the day begins to soften. If you wish, I will be there. Felix Adler." He read it once, corrected a single comma, and folded the paper carefully. It was not a confession. It was an offering of a moment, framed in practicality, and it felt right. The next day, he posted it, and then he returned to his routines as if the act had been no more significant than filing an index card. Yet he noticed, in the quiet spaces between tasks, that his mind would drift briefly toward the idea of her reading it, her fingers smoothing the paper, her eyes taking in his careful phrasing. He did not imagine dramatic reactions. He simply imagined a small pause, a soft smile, perhaps the same quiet warmth she carried when she listened. Her reply came 2 days later, delivered to the library's front desk in an envelope addressed in a hand that was both elegant and controlled. Felix recognized it at once, not because he had studied her writing, but because there was a calmness in the strokes that resembled her voice. He carried it to his office with a steady heartbeat and opened it slowly, as though opening too quickly might disturb the gentleness of the gesture. Inside, the note was brief. Herr Adler, thank you. I will come on Thursday, if the snow allows, and I will trust your promise about the light. Elizabeth, he read it once, then again, and each time the words remained as they were. Simple, practical, quietly warm. He placed the note in his desk drawer, not hidden, merely kept, like a pressed flower that did not need to be displayed to be valued. Thursday arrived with a soft fall of snow that seemed determined to keep the city quiet. Elizabeth came, as she had said, her coat dusted with white, her cheeks lightly flushed from cold. Felix met her at the entrance and guided her through the corridors once more. And though the exhibition room was the same, the experience felt different, as if the pages had become part of their shared language. They stood together before a manuscript whose gold leaf caught the late afternoon light exactly as Felix had promised. Elizabeth's expression softened, and she did not speak at first. The silence between them felt natural, like the pause between musical phrases. When she finally did speak, she said only, "Yes," and Felix understood that she meant more than the light. From that day, notes became part of their rhythm. They were never long. They did not declare anything. They simply arranged the small meetings that their days seemed to want. Sometimes, Elizabeth wrote to ask if Felix knew a bookshop that carried French essays, and Felix replied with the address and a quiet remark about the shopkeeper's fondness for strong coffee. Sometimes Felix wrote to tell her of a public recital at a modest hall where a young pianist would play Schubert softly enough that even shy listeners could relax. Elizabeth answered that she would go if her mother's committee allowed her the evening, and added, almost as a joke, that she might lose her gloves again if the music was too moving. Felix's reply was simple. "If so, I will bring them home with care." The line made him smile as he wrote it, and he suspected it made her smile as she read. Their errand walks grew more intentional as well, though they continued to wear the appearance of practicality. They met at a market stall to choose oranges, bright, fragrant bursts of color against the pale winter. And Felix learned that Elizabeth always chose the ones with slightly imperfect skin because they smelled sweeter. They walked along the canal to buy paper and ink, and Elizabeth remarked that the city looked calmer when reflected in dark water. Felix agreed, and in agreeing he felt something settle in him, a sense that his world had expanded, not by adding noise, but by adding depth. One afternoon, Elizabeth asked if Felix would accompany her to select a small gift for a charity auction. The request was made in a note, politely framed. Herr Adler, if you have an hour on Saturday, I would value your opinion. I must choose something suitable, and I do not trust my own judgment when everything is too polished. Felix read the line twice, struck by the quiet vulnerability in it. He replied that he would be glad to help, and on Saturday they met at a small antique shop where objects rested in careful rows: porcelain figurines, silver frames, music boxes that played when opened. The shopkeeper spoke in reverent tones, as if each item carried a history that needed respect. Felix and Elizabeth moved through the room slowly, and Felix noticed how Elizabeth's hand would hover near certain objects without touching, as if she sensed the weight of their past. They chose a music box in the end, modest and beautifully crafted, its lid painted with a winter scene. When the shopkeeper opened it, the mechanism turned and released a soft melody. thin, delicate, like a lullaby carried through an old house at night. Elizabeth's eyes warmed, and Felix felt the sound settle in him like a promise of calm. "It is small," Elizabeth said, "but it holds something." Felix nodded. "That is often the best kind," he replied. The music box seemed, in that moment, like a cousin to the gloves, another small object that could carry meaning without demanding it. As winter continued, their notes and errands formed a gentle lattice across the weeks. Felix no longer wondered whether seeing Elizabeth again required a reason. The reasons appeared naturally: a book, a concert, a walk for oranges, a quiet hour for tea. Yet he also began to sense the truth beneath those reasons, the one Elizabeth had named in her sitting room. The truth was that they enjoyed each other's company in a way that felt both soothing and strangely essential, like warmth in a cold season. They did not speak of love as a sudden lightning strike. They allowed affection to grow like the city's winter light, slowly lengthening day by day, until one might look back and realize the darkness had retreated without announcement. On evenings when they did not meet, Felix would sometimes sit at his desk and reread her notes, not with obsessive intensity, but with quiet appreciation. He noticed the way she chose words that were precise but gentle, the way she framed invitations as practicalities, as if politeness were a bridge she trusted. Elizabeth, he suspected, did something similar. She seemed the sort of person who would fold a note carefully and place it somewhere safe, not because she was sentimental in an overt way, but because she understood that small objects could hold warmth. One night, after a particularly calm day, Felix stood by his window and watched snow fall under the street lamp. The world outside looked softened, hushed, almost unreal in its quiet. He thought of Elizabeth perhaps doing the same from her own window, watching the same snow, the same lamp halos. The thought did not make him restless. It made him feel connected, as if the city itself were a shared room and the snowfall its gentle curtain. Their next note, which came from Elizabeth, carried an understated shift. It was still practical, still modest, but there was a new steadiness in it. Herr Adler, there will be another gathering soon. Not as large as the winter ball, but something quieter. If you attend, I think it would feel less like an obligation, more like a beginning. Elizabeth. Felix read the line about a beginning and felt a calm warmth spread through him, steady as the fire in her sitting room. He placed the note down, folded his hands, and allowed himself, for the first time, to imagine not only their next meeting, but the gentle shape of what might come after. The invitation arrived, not with the bright ceremony of embossed extravagance, but with the quiet confidence of something meant to be accepted. It came in a cream envelope with a restrained seal, delivered to Felix at the library by a messenger whose boots left small, wet prints on the marble floor. Felix carried it back to his office with a calm attentiveness, as if it were a document that required the same gentle handling as the manuscripts in glass cases. When he opened it, he found that Elizabeth had not exaggerated. It was a gathering, yes, but smaller than the winter ball at the Palais Wallerstein, an evening at a private salon hosted by a patroness known for modest music and good causes, intended to raise funds for a winter relief society. There would be waltzes, but also readings, and the tone promised warmth rather than display. Felix read the card twice, then unfolded Elizabeth's accompanying note, short, precise, and softly personal. Herr Adler, if you come, I think the evening will feel kinder, and I would like to share the music with you. Elizabeth. He sat for a moment with the note in his hand. Outside his window, the late winter light was pale and steady, and the city's sounds were softened by snow. Felix felt no anxiety about etiquette. He had learned, over the weeks, that Elizabeth did not use words lightly. If she said the evening would feel kinder, she meant it. If she said she wished to share the music, she meant that too. He wrote his acceptance that evening at his desk, the lamp's glow warming his hands, and he kept his words simple. Fräulein von Lichtenau, thank you. I will come. Felix, it was enough. The day of the salon arrived with a calm, clear cold. The snow had paused, leaving the city clean and bright, the rooftops white as folded linen. Felix dressed slowly, the way he always did for important occasions, buttoning his shirt with care and smoothing his cuffs until they lay properly. His tuxedo jacket, still the same one from the winter ball, looked freshly brushed, and the familiar weight of it settled on his shoulders like a remembered formality. Yet as he adjusted his bow tie in the mirror, he noticed something different in his own face. He looked less like a man preparing to endure an event, and more like a man preparing to enter a moment. The difference was subtle, but it made his breathing easier. He arrived at the address just after 7. The building was a handsome townhouse in a quiet street, not far from the Stadtpark, its windows glowing with warm light behind curtains. A footman opened the door, and Felix stepped into a foyer that smelled faintly of wax and flowers, and also, unmistakably, of citrus, orange peel and clove, a scent that made winter feel almost festive. Guests' voices drifted from deeper within the house, low and gentle, and somewhere a piano played soft scales, as if warming its fingers. Felix handed over his coat and entered the salon with a calm awareness that this room, though elegant, was not trying to overwhelm anyone. It was arranged to welcome, not to impress. The salon was smaller than the Palais Ballroom, and because of that, it felt more intimate. Lamps cast pools of amber light, and candles flickered in clusters on side tables, their flames reflected in mirrors that made the room seem to breathe. A few dozen guests stood in small groups, speaking quietly, cups in hand. The air carried a soft blend of perfume, tea, and beeswax. A string quartet sat near the far wall, their instruments resting like sleeping animals beside them, and the piano waited with its lid open, catching light along its polished curve. The whole space felt like a carefully held secret, warm against the winter outside. Felix did not need to search long for Elizabeth. She stood near the center of the room, speaking with an older woman whose posture suggested authority softened by kindness. Elizabeth's dress tonight was a shade of deep green, like pine needles in shadow, and it made her look as though winter itself had chosen to clothe her gently. Her hair was arranged simply, and at her wrists were pale gloves, ivory again, fitted and quiet, the embroidery small enough to be discovered rather than announced. When she saw Felix, her expression softened into a smile that was unmistakably for him, and Felix felt, not a rush, but a steady warmth spread through his chest, as if the room's fire had moved closer. "Herr Adler," Elizabeth said when she reached him, her voice calm and low. "Fräulein von Lichtenau," Felix replied, and then, because their formality had always been a kind of kindness rather than a barrier, he added quietly, "Thank you for inviting me." Elizabeth's eyes held his for a moment. "Thank you for coming," she answered. "Now it does feel kinder." They moved together through the room, greeting acquaintances, exchanging polite words that felt lighter in this smaller setting. Felix met the hostess, a woman with silver hair and a voice that could command attention without raising volume. She spoke warmly of the Relief Society, of how winter required not only beauty, but care, and Felix listened with sincere respect. Elizabeth's presence beside him made these exchanges feel less like obligations and more like part of an evening's gentle tapestry. Felix realized as they moved that he was not standing at the edge this time. He was within the room's circle, not because he had changed, but because he had someone to share the circle with. When the music began, it did not begin with a dramatic flourish. The quartet played a soft piece first, something light and careful, as if testing the room's breath. Guests listened with a calm attentiveness, and Felix felt the sound settle into him the way warm tea settled into the body, quietly, steadily. Elizabeth stood beside him, her posture relaxed, her gaze focused, and Felix noticed how her gloved hands rested lightly together, the pale leather catching candlelight. The detail stirred that familiar, gentle amusement. Gloves, once a small accident, now seemed like a symbol carried forward deliberately, though without exaggeration. After the first set, the hostess spoke briefly, thanking guests and explaining the evening's purpose. There was a reading, an excerpt from a winter poem, delivered in a voice that treated each line as if it were a small candle being lit. Felix listened, and he found himself thinking of manuscripts again, of how words could survive centuries and still make a room quiet. Elizabeth's expression suggested she felt the same. Their shared silences had become as meaningful as their shared conversations. Then the piano began to play a waltz. It was not the exact waltz from the winter ball, but it carried the same gentle turning, the same invitation to move without urgency. Couples began to form naturally, and the floor, smaller than a ballroom but polished and open, received them with quiet grace. Felix felt an old instinct rise, to remain a listener rather than a participant. Yet when he glanced at Elizabeth, he saw a calm expectation in her eyes, not pressure, not challenge, simply an openness that made the possibility feel safe. "Will you dance?" she asked, her voice low enough that it felt like a private question. Felix hesitated only for the length of a breath. "Yes," he said, and the word surprised him with its steadiness. Elizabeth's smile was small, warm, and entirely untroubled. She placed her gloved hand in his, and Felix felt the cool softness of leather against his palm. He guided her onto the floor with careful steps. The first turn was slow, measured, as if they were finding the rhythm together. Felix was not a dazzling dancer. He did not sweep her into dramatic motion. Instead, he moved with a quiet attentiveness, listening to the music and to her balance, letting the waltz carry them rather than forcing it. Elizabeth followed with an ease that made him feel supported rather than judged, and as they turned, the room's lamps and candles became a soft blur around them, like stars seen through a thin veil. Felix realized as they moved that dancing with Elizabeth did not feel like performance. It felt like conversation. Their steps spoke in gentle agreement. Forward, back, turn, return. The music held them without demanding anything more than presence. Elizabeth's gloved hand rested lightly in his, and the other hand at his shoulder felt like a quiet anchor. Felix's own breathing slowed. The usual self-consciousness he carried in social rooms softened and fell away, and in its place was a simple steadiness. He was here, and she was here, and the waltz was a circle that held them both. When the piece ended, they did not rush apart. They stepped off the floor with calm, as if the turning had continued inside them even after the music stopped. Elizabeth's cheeks were slightly flushed, her eyes bright in the candlelight. Felix felt a warmth in his own face as well, but it was not embarrassment. It was the gentle afterglow of having allowed himself to be carried. "That was," Elizabeth began, then paused as if searching for the right word. "Kinder," Felix offered softly. and the shared word made her smile. "Yes," she said, kinder and quieter, as if the world has learned to hold its breath. They moved to a table where glasses of light wine and tea were offered, and they stood close enough that their sleeves nearly touched. Around them, guests continued their soft conversations. The quartet began another piece, and the room's atmosphere remained warm and unhurried. Felix found himself looking at Elizabeth's gloves again, noticing how carefully she wore them, how mindful she seemed now of their presence. He felt the faint urge to mention it, to tease gently, but he held back, sensing that tonight the gloves did not need to be made into a joke. They were simply part of the story's continuity, carried forward like a motif in music. Later, as the salon's evening softened toward its end, Elizabeth and Felix stood near a window where the curtains were drawn back slightly. Outside, the street was quiet under snow, lamps glowing in pale halos. Inside, the room hummed with low voices and gentle laughter. Elizabeth turned to Felix, her expression thoughtful. "This feels," she said softly, "like a beginning that does not need to announce itself." Felix looked at her, and in the warm light he saw the calm truth of what she meant. Their story had begun with a small reason, a lost glove, a polite knock. Now it was continuing with chosen moments, tea, notes, gentle errands, and a waltz shared without fear. Felix did not reach for grand words. He did not try to define what was still unfolding. He simply nodded, and his voice, when he answered, was as steady as the winter light. "Yes," he said, "a softer beginning." And as the evening continued to glow around them, Felix felt, with quiet certainty, that this beginning would not vanish when the night ended. It would remain, like warmth, held in a room long after the fire has been tended, steady and calm, waiting to be carried forward. After the second gathering, winter seemed to grow quieter rather than harsher. The cold still held Vienna in its steady grasp, but it no longer felt like something to endure. It felt like a background that made warmth more visible. Felix noticed this most in the mornings, when he left his apartment, and the street lamps were still lit against the pale dawn, and in the evenings, when the city's windows glowed softly like small hearths suspended in stone. In that muted season, the rhythm between him and Elizabeth continued with the same gentle patience it had always had, yet it carried a new ease, as though the waltz they had shared in the salon had set something into alignment. They no longer behaved as if their meetings needed to disguise themselves as accidents. They still cherished small reasons, books, errands, notes, but the reasons had begun to feel like a tender language rather than a necessary excuse. Felix received a note from Elizabeth 2 days after the salon, written on the same cream paper she favored. "Herr Adler, thank you for the waltz. I did not realize how much I missed turning without effort. I will be at the café on Friday at 4 if you would like to join me. Elizabeth." Felix read it at his desk with the quiet satisfaction of someone recognizing a familiar melody. He placed it carefully in his drawer beside her earlier notes, then returned to his work with a steady mind, as if accepting such an invitation was now part of the natural order. On Friday, the café welcomed them with its usual warm hush. The windows were fogged, blurring the street beyond into soft shapes, and cinnamon drifted in the air like a gentle promise. They sat at their usual table near the window, and the waiter brought tea and coffee without asking. There was comfort in these small repetitions, and Felix realized that the comfort itself had become precious. Not because it was grand, but because it was consistent. In a world that often demanded performance and certainty, their companionship asked only presence. For a time, they spoke of simple things, the Relief Society, and whether the salon's funds had been sufficient, the library's newest acquisition. a Russian novel Elizabeth had begun and found both beautiful and exhausting. They laughed softly over the stubbornness of winter, over the way Viennese people spoke of weather as if it were a personality rather than a condition. Felix found himself listening more than speaking, and Elizabeth's voice, calm and measured, seemed to settle his thoughts into order. Yet beneath the surface of their conversation, something else waited. Felix felt it as a gentle pressure, not uncomfortable, but persistent, like a question that had been politely patient for weeks and now wished to be acknowledged. It was Elizabeth who first allowed the silence to lengthen. She set down her cup, folded her hands, and looked at Felix with the steady openness he had come to trust. "Do you remember?" she asked softly. "The first evening? The Palais?" Felix nodded. The memory rose easily. Chandeliers like frozen waterfalls, the waltz's first breath, snow against the windows, Elizabeth in midnight blue, calm at the edge of the room. "Yes," he said, very clearly. Elizabeth's eyes softened. "I have been thinking about the glove," she said, and at the word Felix felt the familiar motif settle between them like a small object placed carefully on the table, not only as an accident, but as a kind of permission. Felix did not interrupt. He waited, attentive in the way he was with delicate pages, allowing the truth to unfold at its own pace. Elizabeth continued, her voice quiet, not fragile, simply sincere. "If you had approached me after the ball without reason, I would have been polite. I would have smiled. And then I would have gone home and told myself that it was nothing, that it was simply the social dance of a winter season." She paused, her gaze lowering briefly to the steam curling above her cup. "But the glove gave us a story. It gave us something that could be repeated without embarrassment, a reason small enough that no one could accuse it of intention." Felix felt a gentle warmth rise. He had always understood the logic of it. Hearing her name it so plainly made it feel both simpler and deeper. "Yes," he said. "It was a safe door." Elizabeth looked up again. "And yet," she added, "the longer it continued, the less safe it became, not because it was dangerous, but because it began to matter." Felix's breath slowed. He could hear the cafés quiet around them, the faint clink of cups, the murmur of voices, the soft creak of wood as someone shifted in their chair. All of it seemed distant, as if the world had stepped back to give their table a little more space. Felix's own thoughts did not rush. They simply settled into clarity. "It mattered to me," he said quietly. The truth did not require ornament. From the first return, perhaps, certainly from the second. Elizabeth's smile appeared, small and steady, and Felix saw relief in it, not triumph. Relief that honesty could be spoken and would not be punished. "To me as well," she said. They sat with that truth between them, and it did not feel heavy. It felt like warmth finally allowed to be named. Felix realized that he had been cautious not because he doubted Elizabeth, but because he respected how fragile beginnings could be if handled roughly. He had wanted their story to remain gentle. Elizabeth, he sensed, had wanted the same. The glove had been their careful way of approaching each other without forcing anything into premature shape. Now, in the café's amber light, the shape had formed anyway, quietly, like snow forming a landscape. "I think," Felix said after a moment, "that small reasons are not a deception. They are a kindness. They let us move slowly enough to remain ourselves." Elizabeth's gaze held his. "Yes," she agreed. "They let us approach without frightening ourselves. You said that once." Her voice softened further. "And now, I do not feel frightened." Felix felt his shoulders relax, as if he had been holding tension without noticing. "Neither do I," he said. Elizabeth reached for her gloves on the table, turning them in her hands with thoughtful care. The pale leather looked luminous against the dark wood, and Felix was struck again by the quiet beauty of such an ordinary object. She smiled faintly. "It is almost embarrassing," she said, "to think that something as small as a glove could lead to this." Felix's smile answered hers. "In my work," he said, "the smallest marginal note can change the meaning of an entire page." Elizabeth's eyes warmed. "Then perhaps," she said, "we should respect the margin." They continued to talk, but now their conversation moved with a new openness. They spoke of what it felt like to be seen without being examined, to be listened to without being judged. Elizabeth admitted that her life often required a kind of graceful distance, a polite separation between her inner self and the world's expectations. With Felix, she said, she did not feel the need to keep that distance so firmly. Felix, in turn, spoke of how his quietness had often been interpreted as absence, when in truth, it had always been a form of attention. With Elizabeth, he felt that attention met its match, not in intensity, but in understanding. When they finally rose to leave the cafe, the afternoon had deepened toward evening. The lamps outside were already lit, their halos soft in the falling snow. Felix paid, as he often did, and Elizabeth accepted it with calm, not because she needed him to, but because the gesture had become part of their rhythm, another small kindness exchanged without struggle. They stepped outside, scarves drawn up against the cold, and began to walk slowly along the street. The city felt quieter than usual, as if Vienna itself were listening. Snow fell in steady, patient flakes, and each one caught the lamp glow briefly before vanishing. Felix and Elizabeth walked side by side without urgency. Their sleeves brushed once, lightly, and neither of them moved away. The contact was small, almost accidental, yet it felt deliberate in its comfort. At a corner where the street opened toward a small square, Elizabeth paused. The square was empty except for a few bare trees and a bench dusted with snow. The world seemed composed of soft edges, lamp halos, drifting white, quiet stone. Elizabeth turned toward Felix, and her expression held a calm certainty. "I do not want," she said softly, "to pretend any longer that we are only meeting by accident." Felix felt the simple truth of that settle in him like a warm blanket. "Nor do I," he replied. Elizabeth's gloved hand lifted slightly, hesitated, then rested lightly on his forearm, not gripping, not claiming, simply touching as one touches something reassuring. Felix covered her hand with his own, gently, feeling the cool leather beneath his palm and the steady warmth beneath it. The gesture was quiet, but it carried a fullness that needed no louder words. In that moment, Felix understood what their story had been teaching them all along. Destiny, if it existed, did not always announce itself with bright banners. Sometimes it arrived in the smallest of reasons, offering repeated chances to return, to speak, to walk together in snow-lit streets. Sometimes it asked for patience, for gentleness, for the courage to let affection grow without forcing it into spectacle. Their truth had not been hidden. It had simply been allowed to unfold at its natural pace. They resumed walking, and the city seemed to open before them like a quiet path. Felix did not know what spring would bring. He did not know how their lives would change. But he knew, with calm certainty, that the small reasons had served their purpose. They had led them here, to a truth spoken without fear, to a warmth held openly. And as they moved through the snow, Vienna around them soft and hushed, Felix felt as though the world itself had blessed their gentleness by matching it. In the days that followed the truth spoken at the café and carried into the snowlit square, Vienna did not change its winter face. The streets remained pale, the rooftops white, the air crisp enough to make each breath feel like a small ritual. Yet for Felix, the city's familiar scenes acquired a softer depth, as if an unseen lantern had been lit behind them. He walked the Ringstrasse with the same measured pace, passed the same facades and statues, heard the same distant bells. But now each sound and surface seemed to hold a quiet echo of Elizabeth's presence. Not because he was lost in romance like a fever, but because companionship, once acknowledged, has a gentle way of settling into everything. It does not disrupt. It warms. It makes the ordinary feel less solitary. Elizabeth, too, moved through her winter obligations with a new ease. There were committees, visits, polite evenings, where she had to smile at the right moments, and none of that disappeared. Yet when Felix met her afterward, sometimes at the café, sometimes in a quiet street where snow muffled their steps, her shoulders seemed to lower, as if she had placed down a weight she had been carrying without noticing. Their time together remained steady and modest. They did not announce themselves to Vienna. They did not seek witnesses. They simply continued, allowing their story to be what it had always been, a series of small reasons that had become a shared life in miniature. The gloves, which had once been the first gentle excuse, remained in their orbit like a quiet emblem. Elizabeth did not lose them again in any dramatic way. Instead, she treated them with the faint humor of someone who respects a symbol but does not worship it. Once, as they stood near the entrance of the library after an afternoon among manuscripts, she adjusted her gloves with careful fingers and said, "You see, they are behaving." Felix answered, "Perhaps they have learned that they no longer need to run ahead of us." Elizabeth smiled at that, and the smile held the calm satisfaction of a story that had found its right pace. As winter leaned toward its late season, the city began to show small signs of change that only attentive eyes would notice. Snow still fell, but sometimes it melted by midday, leaving wet cobblestones that reflected lamplight like dark mirrors. In certain sheltered corners, the air smelled faintly of damp earth rather than pure cold. Market stalls carried not only oranges and nuts, but the first hints of new produce, modest and pale. Vienna, like a person waking slowly, did not rush toward spring. It stretched, it breathed, and Felix and Elizabeth moved through that gradual shift, as if they were learning, together, how to inhabit not only winter's calm, but the quiet promise of what comes after. One evening, Elizabeth invited Felix to her family's residence for a small supper, framed in the same gentle practicality that had always guided them. There were no grand introductions. Her mother, a composed woman with steady eyes, greeted Felix with a courtesy that was cool at first, then softened as Felix spoke with simple sincerity about the library, the Relief Society, and the modest ways a city cared for its own. Felix did not attempt charm. He offered steadiness, and Elizabeth's mother, perhaps more attuned than most to the difference between noise and substance, seemed to recognize it. After supper, when Elizabeth and Felix returned to the sitting room where their first tea had been served, the fire was low and the lamps cast a warm glow against lace curtains. The room felt like a circle closed gently, not in finality, but in completion. Elizabeth stood by the window for a moment, watching snow drift past the street lamp outside. Felix joined her, not pressing close, simply standing at her side. The world beyond the glass was quiet, softened into gray and white. Inside, the house held warmth in its walls. Elizabeth spoke softly, her voice almost the same as the snow's hush. "Do you ever think," she asked, "about how easily it could have been different? If you had not found the glove, if you had handed it to an attendant and forgotten, if I had been too proud to accept a visit from a stranger with an envelope?" Felix considered, and his answer came with the calm honesty that had become his natural language with her. "Yes," he said, "but I do not think of it with regret. I think of it as proof that life offers doors. Sometimes we notice, sometimes we do not. This time, we did." Elizabeth's gaze remained on the falling snow, but her hand found his arm lightly, a touch that had become familiar and quiet. "A small door?" she murmured. "A small door," Felix agreed. "The kind that does not frighten anyone." Elizabeth turned her head slightly, her expression gentle in the lamplight. "And yet," she said, "it opened into something very real." Felix did not need to answer with grand declarations. He simply took her hand, gloved and warm beneath the leather, and held it with steady care. In that gesture was everything their story had always favored: gentleness over spectacle, continuity over drama, warmth over urgency. They stood like that for a time, watching Vienna outside settle deeper into night. When Felix eventually left, the street was quiet and clean, snow lying softly on ledges and rooftops. The lamps along the way cast their halos, and the city looked as though it were wrapped in a long white scarf. Felix walked without hurry. He felt no restless need to plan the future in sharp outlines. He knew there would be obstacles. Time always brings them. Life always does. But he also knew they had already learned the most important skill: how to move toward each other in small, kind steps, without forcing, without fear. At home, Felix lit his lamp and removed his coat with unhurried care. The room greeted him with its familiar quiet. He made tea, letting the kettle's soft sounds fill the space, and sat at his desk for a moment, not to work, but to let the day settle. Outside his window, snow continued to fall, slow and patient, and he thought of Elizabeth, perhaps watching it from her own window, the same winter curtain drawing itself gently across the city. He felt a calm gratitude, not sharp, not overwhelming, simply deep. Gratitude for small reasons, for quiet courage, for a glove left behind and returned, for a waltz remembered, for a truth spoken softly at the right time. Vienna, as midnight approached, dimmed its lights one by one. Tram bells grew rarer, footsteps became fewer. Even the wind seemed to lower its voice. The city's great buildings stood in stillness, their stone warmed faintly by the day's last hours. Snow gathered on the branches of bare trees like gentle lace. In that quiet, Felix felt the world's softness settle over him, and he let his breathing slow, matching the city's calm rhythm. If you are listening to this story as night surrounds you, may you feel what Felix felt in that winter hush, that life can be gentle, and that fate often arrives disguised as small kindnesses. May your thoughts loosen their grip and drift like snowflakes, light and untroubled. May warmth gather around you, steady as candlelight, and may your heart rest in quiet certainty. And when you close your eyes, may you slip into deep, peaceful sleep, carried by calm dreams, as Vienna sleeps under snow.